Okay, welcome. So today what I wanted to discuss was some ideas about gesture, which seem to be the most common questions that people continue to have, but start to expand that a little bit and expand that specifically into a thinking of gesture as applied to anything, right? So really open up the idea of the technique as something that is analytical and not tied to a specific subject. We've talked about this briefly when it comes to the analysis of plants or natural forms, but today I wanted to talk a little bit more about animals. And so what I'm going to do in the beginning is give a brief description of what we already understand about gesture and this 16-line method and why that works when we describe the figure, or what it is that it's describing when we look at the figure. And then we're just going to try to retool it and see if we can introduce that same technique to drawing horses and cats. Okay, so what I'm starting out with here is just 3 skeletons, right? And so what I want to do with the 3 skeletons is just discuss the similarities and differences. Okay, so when we were discussing gesture in the long format lecture that has to do with the asymmetries of rhythm, one thing that was really important was that when we looked at the figures, we described that there were 8 parts. Right, so I'm going to really try to condense that longer lecture into some key ideas. But again, if you're uncomfortable still with it, you can go back and rewatch that. So there's 8 parts, right, in the figure, and they are comprised of the head, the rib cage, the pelvis. We talk about there being 2 arms and 2 legs, and there you go. You just got your money's worth out of this video. 2 arms, so obvious. And then the most important thing there is the spine, and then that's the 8th. And what we do in that lecture is we describe the importance of maintaining a sense of asymmetry, right? That counterposition and that balance of movement, or that juxtaposed tension of the peak of those curves to produce in the viewer's attention a feeling of rhythm. And that's really important, right? Because when we look at these parts and pieces more in that lecture, what we end up arriving at is that the figure truly is this chaotic tower. And so that rhythmic exchange and that rhythmic tension is very well suited to a technique describing a realistic tension, a realism of how the body actually works. And that would be in counter to the idea that I think intuitively we all understand, which is that we want to begin by outlining the contours, but quite often that creates the opposite. It creates a static, closed off, stagnant figure or feeling for a figure. So in super summary, these are the things that we're looking at in the 16-line approach and that analytical rhythmic gesture, right? And I'll show you this again with the figure in a second so that you can get a sense of that. But why can't we just do the same thing for animals? Is my question. So let's start with that as a question. Do animals need like a whole new gesture? Do we need to come up with a whole new system? Well, ideally, no, right? I don't want to. I would prefer not to. So let's see if we can take this template for how we understand gesture and just move it over into a different subject. We've done it with plants. We've done it with other animals in like a dynamic sketching sense. So let's try that. Let's see how that works. So are there 8 parts in animals? There's a head, there's a rib cage, there's a pelvis, there's 2 arms, there's 2 legs, and then there's a spine. Okay, so this would be the first lesson in, let's say, like a comparative anatomy course, where we not only compare the designs of animals and people, but compare techniques for how to draw them, and then even eventually describe the anatomy. So that's our 8, but before we go too much further, let's think a little bit about what's different between them. Right, so we don't just say, yeah, there's 8 and that's it, and then let's move on. Well, there's 8, but there's differences. So let's look at those differences. Well, what would the first difference be? On the figure, the head is 2/3 cranium to about 1/3 jaw. So and then we get that shape. Animals is usually varied, or let's say the reverse. It's closer to being 1/3 cranium and then 2/3 jaw or nose. So what I'm doing here is I'm just using some basic forms to envelope and design a really simplified ideal for what that skull and head would be. You can take that a step further, and sometimes what I like to do is I like to think about, let's say you're more interested in shape early on. Every animal is its own form language, right? So if we understand that, all of our basic forms have a psychology that's associated with them. Boxes might be stable, spheres may be more dynamic or passive, depending on how they're oriented. Triangles could be stable or aggressive, again, depending on how they're oriented. But for me, the horse is always a mixture of like boxes that had babies with triangles. They're always hyper stable, and so we could use the little head as a case study to see that abstraction, right? So the head is really a box triangle baby, right? So, but that to me speaks in a different way the language of the animal, the form language of the animal. And I could see that repeated in the animal. Again, another quick tangent, but look at the scapula shape. It's essentially just the head again at a different angle, right? That's their shoulder blade. Okay, too much. Let's now talk about the big core masses. So when we looked at the figure, what I did with my figure here was just put it into that, contact with the ground. So as if we were walking like the animals, we would be, again, another side mode, digitigrades. We would walk on the tips of our toes if we were on all four, and that is consistent and true with a lot of quadrupeds. Here I've just done a horse and a cat, but the only animals that wouldn't walk on their tips would be maybe bears and monkeys, and those are plantigrades. So like planting their palms on the ground as opposed to digitigrades, so walking on our fingers. Cats and horses and dogs are also on their tips or on the tips of their toes. Okay, so that's a ground plane there. Okay, rib cage. So what's different and similar about rib cages? So rib cages, remember we did the basic egg, and then we oriented it, if it were standing, more vertical, but that's about the shape that I'd be working with in this position. Now the rib cage for the horse is a little different. It's way bigger. So it's kind of this massive thing here. Now why would it be massive? All right, well we got to back up one more step and look at what would be that governing part that is really important in gesture, which is the spine. But first let's just take a look at how would I define the rib cage as a basic form. Well, if I just look at the comparison of eggs, right, so this is a smaller, slighter egg that narrows at the top. The rib cage on the horse is much wider, larger, especially towards the bottom. So I would think about it gaining width if I were to draw through it down here, especially how it kind of comes out and then turns and goes back in. So what we want to think about here, though, is if this is the front plane for our rib cage, that's the sternum, that would normally be facing out and forward on us, but the sternum for the horse would be down and facing towards the ground, so down there. Think of animals as, people in profile, just to get, a rough sense of what's going on, walking on all fours, right? You're just seeing them in profile most of the time. So why is the rib cage so much larger? Well, it's that spine again. So remember, in the spine we had a cervical, which was our neck portion, and in there was 7. Following that we had a thoracic, and in that thoracic there was 12. So I'm just going to put that little number 12 there. And then in our lumbar there was 7. And what was really crucial when we were doing our gestures, our figure gestures, was that we saw early on that those different angles in the spine helped give rise to that chaotic tower, or that constant and realistic juxtaposition of angle that created balance. Okay, but there's a slight difference, right? Because in the figure we have the tower. When we're standing, we're bipedal. Animals are more of a bridge. So when I'm thinking of the basic design of a horse, dog, cat, or any quadruped, I'm actually thinking more about in terms of understanding the dynamic of movement and balance, what kind of bridge am I dealing with? Right, so the horse is a stable bridge. The cat is a really flexible and dynamic bridge. The dog is some kind of hybrid between them. But that bridge is created by the spine. So it has to do with the type of spine, the number of vertebrae, and then what the function of the animal is, what its job is. So here's the fun thing, or the interesting thing. The spine in the horse still has 7, cervical. It's just that each one gets larger and longer. So you could still have that number 7, it's just bigger. Each piece is bigger. When we get into the thoracic vertebrae grows. So here we had 12. Well, the horse can have 18. So that means there's 6 extra. And I can barely do math. So we have 6 extra, and what that does, because let's go back to our basic shape here. This shape is wider and longer because there's been 6 additional vertebrae added, thoracic vertebrae. So that stacks more ribs and creates a longer rib cage. So why would we want that? Well, the horse is a herbivore. It eats plants, hay, grasses, and the effect of that is, or the impact of that, is that it needs a larger digestive tract to break all that down. So the rib cage is longer to support that larger digestive tract. That creates a stable back though, so we're able to kind of also ride them and sit on them. But in terms of its growth, right, so the vertebrae themselves, it also creates this fin here. So there's a taller, that's called the spinuous process of the rib cage. That helps support what would be directly underneath it, the scapula. And then as we get into the lumbar, we're going to back to our basic 5 here. But because we've extended the rib cage, that means that the pelvis ends up being very, very close to the rib cage. I'm just going to make a little box here for that. Our box was wider and maybe more proportionate to the width of the rib cage, the pelvis that is. And then the horse, it would be a little bit slimmer. One thing that you could try to pay attention to though is this angle, the tilt that you would leave this at. That would be, even though I'm not dealing with these forms right now, we're just thinking of gesture. I'm giving you little tips where you might want to explore a construction stage later, know a little bit more about the skeleton, but I'm trying to throw in these little tips here and there so that when you're thinking gesture, you have a little bit of knowledge behind the reason, the posing, the capacity or the character of the subject that you're looking at. But this tilt, the closer it gets to horizontal, the more stable an animal. The closer it gets to being more diagonal, the more dynamic or springy the animal. So see, cats would have a really dynamic one. So that would be the play of the spine. More in the thoracic, less in the lumbar, and that sets up, in total, a type of bridge. By putting that rib cage and pelvis really close together, by making the neck longer, in terms of the length of each vertebrae, my horse can now reach the ground to eat, and it has this really compact relationship between rib cage and pelvis, which makes it very stable. Okay, so that's a way to reinterpret what's going on here by, again, going back to what was key, which is the spine. So I'm trying to look at the story of each animal through the spine. So what is going on with the arms and the legs? Like, without getting into a discussion of bones, let's just give one tip there. And that tip will be, when I started drawing animals, again, just like figures, I would start from the outside, and then I would do the body and then the legs. And it always looked like some kind of weird alien that was pooping something out of its body. But it didn't look natural or like there was rhythm or anatomical, expressive quality. So here's in sum, what we see with the animal's 4 legs, this is the scapula, and the scapula sits alongside the body, so it's this shape. And that would move with the arm as the arm goes forward and back. So it kind of turn or swing like a pendulum. So let's give this a color just so it sits, we can see it sitting alongside the rib cage. So that means when I'm looking at the animal, the shoulder is meshed with the silhouette. Okay. Now the other thing that would be meshed with the silhouette is here is the head of the humerus. So, right, we'll do a little comparison really early. So our scapula would be like this. We have a lot more range of motion in our scapula because a key difference here is that our scapula connects to our clavicle and creates that girdle over our rib cage. A horse's will not. And then we would have our humerus, right? And the humerus would, do all kinds of crazy stuff, and it's really long and all that. The humerus on the horse goes the opposite angle, and then the elbow would end up right above or below the rib cage, depending on the animal. But with the horse, I would put it right alongside. So that is the humerus. Now, what's important to pay attention to there is a forward and a back. Right? So, or an arrow. Think of an arrow pointing forward. So we're still finding, my basic argument is this. Naturalistic form has the same theme or same key ingredients which will allow us to use the same quality of gesture, even if it isn't exactly the same. Okay, that's the humerus. Well, what comes next? This is the radius and the ulna, fused. Okay, well, what's after that? This is the wrist. Right, so that would be the kind of what looks like a knee in the front, maybe. But the point here is what I'm seeing below the silhouette of the torso is the forearm, the wrist, the hand, and then the finger, which I'm always going to pull forward to try to show some of that weight as the horse is standing on the tip of the toe. So, how can we think of that? I'll do an arrow and then maybe like a, kind of an expressive C curve. Right? So this is going to be a formulaic way to think of any cat, dog, horse, any quadruped. So you can use that as a formulaic way to start to show movement and distill that into gesture. What's going on with the back? How would we gesture the limb on the back? Well, first let's talk about what's going on. Here is the pelvis. This is the femur. So femur comes forward. Again, look at the play of angle here, though. I have the pelvis going back. I have the femur coming forward. That's the knee. This is the tibia-fibula combination. Here is the ankle. This is the calcaneus. This is the foot bone. Here is the toe. Right? Same or similar design. What I like to do from the back is use the arrow again, pelvis to femur. Right, so see how those kind of match? I forget who, but there's one animal artist that does a great job of showing how that, which is the scapula, the humerus in front, is counter in direction to the pelvis, femur in the back, and then the rib cage is kind of in the middle, like bracketed, as if by parentheses of those two starting forms. But then the lower leg could also be one sweep. But what I like to do with this one here is bring one sweep from the front of that pelvis all the way down and into the bottom. So here I'm looking for an S curve. Sometimes you can even drop a curve on the back if you want to start to hint at some suggestive muscle. That would be hamstring. Right? But what I'm looking for there is playful asymmetries or playful long lines of dynamic rhythm, expressive rhythm. Okay, but that's an easy way to try to distill all of this. Now look at, just as a point of interest, look how much longer our femurs are. Notice the difference in length in these little silly mock-ups between the femur of the horse, the femur of the cat, the femur of the human. Like this is a machine that is slow. This is a machine that is fast. This is a machine that is fast. So this is an endurance animal, of course, right? A horse can run long distances. We're not good at running long distances really at all, comparatively. So notes about the horse, and that gives us a big survey of everything, and then some basic designs for how we could treat these forms that are really complex and hard more simply. So let's do a quick final comparison so that you have some contrast of the figure, the horse, and then the cat. What's unique about the cat? So let's start with the head again. 1/3, 2/3 in terms of the overall proportioning of the jaw. But when we talked about the horse, we spoke of the difference in form language there. Cats, I would say, are more like if spheres could have a baby with triangles. Everything is sharp and aggressive, more predatory. So the head's more like that. And I find that shape, again, repeated in lots of different areas, even shoulder blade, again. Okay, let's do spine next. So spine is 7 cervical. You can notice even though it's 7, it's still not as long, but it's long enough to reach the ground from the height of the body. The next is thoracic. Well, thoracic is 12. So there isn't, again, that, like the horse, there's not that +6. So that keeps it relatively similar to us. And then that keeps the rib cage slightly more narrow. So this maybe we'd think of as a teardrop. It's narrow at the front and then it gets a little wider towards the back. So a little teardrop shape as opposed to this larger barrel-like form that is the rib cage on the horse. We could draw through that here. So that's a fun place to kind of compare animals to humans, is just in the way that you would think your form language. You know, you get used to drawing eggs and ellipses and cylinders a certain size to suggest your subject, which is the human, or mostly the human for me. But it's a great challenge when we move that out into an animal because you have to retool that and develop a different sensitivity. And I know that because I'm not especially good at it yet. Okay, so what's different here is, well, in the lumbar, I have +2. So they have 2 extra. So they can have up to 7 in the lumbar. That means that that pelvis is pushed out a bit further, and now I have this great capacity for expansion and contraction in there, which is like the pounce of the cat or the dynamic leap of the cat. You know how cats could kind of push themselves back into that compacted pre-pounce state and then explode onto whatever it is there, your arm or your head or an animal. So that's the difference. Look at it in a difference of bridge. The horse is an endurance bridge. The human is an awkward bridge in this position. And the cat is a bridge built from a dynamic sensibility. Right? So we put a little different notation there for that, however you want to think it, But the arm is the same. Shoulders, same basic makeup, that is. So if I'm going to gesture this area, I could think of a curve, right? But that curve is summarizing the direction between scapula and humerus. And then counter that into the forearm. So I'm ending the humerus there, that's the elbow. Difference between cats and horses. Cats have both radius and ulna because they can pronate and supinate. Horses don't. And then horses have 1 toe, right? And cats have 5 fingers, palm, more human-like there. So that could be a simple abstraction, right? To kind of place the arm, shoulder and arm, so that we're not getting bogged down by detail because we're thinking about making gestures. Same thing with the femur. We can do that backwards, forwards triangle, pelvis to femur, or you could find the point of your pelvis and try to get one long sweeping line down, one long sweeping S. Right, so you see a comparison there. Maybe a horse is a little bit longer, of course, because it's proportionally higher up. Cats might be a little more compact of an S, and then maybe I'll drop that hamstring down a little bit lower. Right? But hopefully that gives you some basic ideas for what's happening with the skeleton compared out, how I can maintain my basic formula of asymmetry, my counterbalance or chaotic tower, and then distill that through an organization of the 8 parts. What I'll do next is I'm going to take you over to examples and show you directly how I'll do all this if I compare it from my 16-line figure out. Okay, so now we're just going to see how it comes out in the wash with technique, right? I've made the case for how it's the same in terms of how we approach and think through the dynamics of that analytical quality. But now let's go to our 16 line. So the 16 lines that we use to break down the figure, which, it wasn't a mandatory 16, it was just a suggestion. And here's how I started that, using this as a reference. I started with the head, made a basic shape. Doesn't really matter what the head is. Remember, we're using mostly asymmetry and wrapping lines. Next, I'm looking for my spine. So when I break down the spine, I use 4 lines: cervical, thoracic, a stretch, and the lumbar. Now, with the figure, that ends up, when we practice gesture enough with the figure, that ends up being pretty specific in terms of my length. The length of each line is proportioned to what the skeleton would be for the whole based on the head height or the head size. So cervical, thoracic, here's the stretch, which kind of represents that pull of the body from sternum through abdomen down to pelvis. Lumbar, I'm analyzing the different turn in the lumbar. Again, it's not meant to be contour. It's analyzing and trying to keep that flow of rhythm throughout. Lumbar is here. Then pelvis. Lumbar is caught by this curvature of the pelvis. If you ever feel like this starts to get a little bit too kind of disparate and disconnected feeling, just come in, work some rubber bands over and see if you can gather it into something that feels more solid, dimensional as a form. And then legs. So what am I doing with legs? I'm trying to couch the femur into something that will build with that flow, that overall sense of rhythm. And then I'm creating essentially a long S. So you could do that. You could make one long S, or occasionally I'll break that up, femur, and then do an overlap or a carryover, more better term there, and let that flow like an S curve down into the foot and define some kind of foot or ground plane. If you want, you could do a little square box on the ground. It doesn't really matter to me if it helps. On this side, same thing. Let's do, so how can I relate, right? That's always the goal with gestures. How can I relate one line that I'm currently making to the rest of what's come before? So this curve here, maybe this relates to that throw or visual dynamic of the thoracic. Okay, so that works. And then femur, right? That is a line that represents the femur. Hopefully it goes without saying that gesture is just the preliminary stage of the drawing. It doesn't have to be exact. It's something you will build on. So I'm trying to get the base abstraction of the figure while still maintaining the most important ideas for what I find to be realistic about the body. In this case, movement and kind of a dynamic tension. Arms. Arms I usually will build off the neck, right? So that shoulder line can build off the neck. That's one line for the shoulder. I do one line for the humerus, and then you can catch and counter a line here into the forearm. I'm just going to let that sweep out and into the hand. Same thing on this side. Now, there's not really a lot to build off here, so maybe I'll try to pull around or off that wrapping line. Give some kind of loose connection. And then I lose the arm, and then it comes kind of back around here. That's it. Done. I wouldn't do any more for a gesture. So the idea now is, can I take these same lines, bend them, position them horizontally, and then use the same thinking of asymmetry, movement, and flow, but let it also become an animal, so I don't have to learn a whole new system of drawing. So let's try. Maybe the answer is no. I don't know. We'll see. So let's try some of these guys. We're going to try, let's start with that one. So I'm going to do, this is how I would think through it. Here's my head. You can leave it as a basic ball. If you want, though, you can add the kind of the extra shape if it helps contextualize what it is you're doing. So remember I talked about how the lion is the sphere and the triangle made a baby. Okay, cervical. I think that the lion's skull is going to be held forward with that neck kind of coming back and down. That's my cervical. So cervical, and then I'm going to go, instead of going right into the thoracic, I'm going to go into the stretch. Remember how we did cervical, thoracic, and the animal, I'm going to go from this to this, the front stretch curve. I think that has a nicer, more consistent flow into the thoracic. So from this into that, now I'm going to put my thoracic here. So I'm trying to think about the proportion of each too. Remember we talked about the difference in length between thoracic and lumbar in horse and animal, and then lumbar here. So that gives me my bounce, my rhythm from this to this. Remember the goal in each line, just as a reminder when I was doing these for the figure, is that every curve is comprised of diagonals. And that's what's really helping push the movement, right? There's no verticals or horizontals here. And then I'm thinking that's the pelvis. So again, maybe you feel like this is a little too loose. Let's add some wrapping lines. So this is, it's kind of 3/4, of course. So here's my torso and then ending into the pelvis back here. Now let's do those arms. So remember we talked about the arms as being the scapula to the humerus, and that created that arrow pointing forward. And then we had the forearm to the paw and fingers. So I could see that. In cats, when they walk, that always pushes above the spine. So that's what this little line is. But let's make that simpler. Let's do a curve. Let's just do something, right? It's just this again. It's two diagonals fused into a nice curve to try to create that same dynamic tension. This counter curve, that would be their tricep in here. You can use that if you want, and then let that kind of flow down into the forearm would be. And that really is enough, right? It's not like I'm doing much more than that with my figures. You could see like the hit of the wrist or the way that the palm starts to come forward. It could be helpful, like I mentioned in the figure, if you want to do a ground plane. Just something to kind of help early on with maintaining the sense of the whole and the proportions. Let's do the other side. So this is coming forward. What I'd be seeing here would be the humerus and forearm. Maybe we just turn that into like a curve for now. That could be a curve and maybe push forward. And then for the pelvis, let's find the pelvis, right? So I can see the area of the waist coming off of or tapering coming off of the rib cage. I wouldn't draw these lines, I'm just trying to give you some indication. And then what I see for the leg would be, here's my pelvis, one beautiful sweeping C curve or S curve. The knee is lower than the torso, so we'd have our knee, and then that plays right into the foot. So like a spring, right? That dynamic quality of spring. This is the hamstring, a little bit lower. And then back here we have our calf, right? Then that would broaden into the foot. So there I'm just trying to give you a little bit more context so you could see what I'm thinking. But you could just leave it as one line. Even with the broader development though, everything is still asymmetrical. High to low, high to low. The foot on this side is coming forward. So imagine your hip, S curve, forward. Last thing is tail. Tail is always an extension or a continuation of the spine. So I like to use it to dramatic effect. Maybe we could have it feel like it's coming off there, or you could extend it in a different way. The only thing you don't want to do is make it have like a disconnected vibe, a disconnection. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense, but let's do some more. Let's try that again from a profile and do it a little bit faster now. So here's my head. If you want, you can play around with some different shapes so you start to feel a different relationship to cranium to jaw, cervical. I'm going to think of that stretching forward off the neck, lumbar. Oh, I'm sorry, thoracic. I'm losing it. Then lumbar. So I'm taking my lumbar there. So there's my head to torso. Now let's talk a little bit now more about differences in weight. We didn't talk too much about weight. On the figure, it's always the implication, or it's implied that there'd be that weight-bearing leg. For an animal, it might be weight-bearing legs, or a weight-bearing forearm, a weight-bearing back leg. The weight was on this one, so that's why I started with it. I do like to start with the weight-bearing forms, and then looks like it might be, it's hard to see, it would be hard to guess in the back one, but maybe this one. Anyways, 2/3 of the animal's weight is generally held here in the front, with 1/3 back here. And that might be something interesting to keep in mind just for the sake of posing or building anticipation, or trying to play with like more advanced qualities of positioning your gesture. So let's do that here too. Now we'll think about that. Let's start with our weight-bearing form. And let's do the boomerang shape. Or I've talked about this as an arrow. It could also look like a boomerang. This is my scapula, just to build context. This is the top of the shoulder. This is the elbow. You could kind of see there. So you could do a curve, you could do a boomerang, you could be an arrow. So any of those. And then what I like to do from there is think about the relationship of that tricep down and let this flow into the leg. Something like that. And then when you get to a point where you're ready to start building anatomy, you could balance that again with the forearm muscles. In this case, those would be the extensors. But what you want is enough to give yourself a read of proportion, right? The height of the leg in relationship to the torso, and then a feeling of weight on the ground. This side comes forward. So let's design that little curve. And I haven't been doing too much in the way of wrapping lines for now, but I really just what I want to focus on is how those 16 lines, or I want you to try to focus on for this, how those 16 are becoming repurposed, right? The same ones that you had a familiarity with from the figure, but just becoming something different. And then here's the back leg. So let's say our pelvis is in here. I'm thinking this where that leg would be. Here's my weight-bearing form, S. That's going to be always where I would start. My argument here would be that that still carries with it a little bit of rhythm off the torso. Let's move mine back. That first one looked a little too close. And then I could build out some thickness in that if I want. Right, so here would be the back of the hamstring comes out, back of the foot there. Other leg. So this is a really beautifully pulled back and stretched leg now. So that one I'm going to build off where I think the front of that pelvis is. The idea is that my pelvis line plays into that rhythmically. And let's do one nice big S here. And then if we want, we could build out some of that back. Just kind of create these curves back here for the hamstring, the taper of the calf into the top of the foot, and then the ground. So we'd have our lion profile, and then let's do a little fun, playful tail that helps extend and create that extra rhythm off the back. Okay, so this one's very much the same. So let's try some horses just to create some contrast with this. Again, not trying to find or express any great level of detail here. I'm really just trying to establish some way of thinking gesture that can unify all the different things that we do. And let's just try this one here now. So we have our two cats we've been through. Let's try the horse and 3/4. First thing, start with our head. If you want, you can create that box triangle baby shape. Now, same thing. Remember I did 1, cervical, 2, stretch, 3, thoracic, 4, lumbar into pelvis, and then arms and legs from there. So let's take that as our same kind of start. Cervical, longer, right? And just kind of trying to match the overall direction of that neck. From there, let's do our stretch. So rib cage, this is a 3/4, thoracic. Let's make this a little bit longer, maybe push something towards a bit more of a straight in terms of that. Pelvis, lumbar and then pelvis. And then here let's feed through some wrapping lines just so we get the feeling of the turning. Okay. Just to be clear, 1, cervical, 2, so kind of feeling this line down and back, the stretch, 3, thoracic, 4, lumbar, 5, right? So scratchy and searching, but aiming to find the right place in relationship to the one before is the intention there. And nothing is intended to be perfect and mechanical, and I don't really care about that style of drawing where everything needs to be correct as soon as we put the line down. It's always much more interesting to me as a language or as a system of analysis. Okay, now let's do the same with the legs. I'm going to start with that weight-bearing leg over here. I could feel that coming out and back. That's the appearance of the boomerang on the other side, or the arrow on the other side. So we could sweep it, or you could use that sharper arrow, whatever you like. And then I'm going to put a longer line so that we feel that different proportion from horse to cat. Again, if it's helpful, we can try to establish some kind of basic ground plane here. And then let's do this on the other side. Arrow. Now, if we got a little bit more advanced, right, and we're moving past gesture and wanting to think more about skeleton and anatomy, what's happening here is one arrow is static because there's weight on it. The other one is slowly starting to turn up, like you're moving or turning a dial, and that's because the leg is raising, right? So all that's coming forward as the leg comes out, foreleg. So you could try to indicate for that. Maybe I do a little bit of a bend, try to shift that up a bit. And then from this, let's create a counter curve, counter rhythm. There's my foreleg. I'm going to use some wrapping lines to help that read as we try to introduce it in space. This is their wrist. Here's the hand, and then finger. So I could better just to kind of give that a C curve. Again, my large failure with animals is any detail too early usually makes these bulky and poorly designed. So I'm trying to do my best to give a gesture to start things out so that I don't get over encumbered. Now on the back, we can feel that, you can see how this is wider, fuller rib cage. There's less space like we would see in the cats for that area of the distance, rib cage and pelvis. And so I'm thinking about moving all of that up, but using a similar design for my leg. Let's say pelvis is around here. Let's do a long, graceful, beautiful S-curve to help establish that. And then that integrates it into the body as a whole, where we can start to think about, you know, the leg not being pooped out of the bottom like it did when I started drawing animals, and still occasionally do. And then if you want, you could add a little bit more. Maybe I'll do something that shows more of like the shape of that back leg, the hamstring, just like on the cat. Remember we did the shape of the side of the hip to the knee. These are quadriceps and hamstrings. After that, you would have your lower leg, or their lower leg, calf to foot, right? And then the type of foot. So that's what this is. I'm just trying to keep it in a way that's gestural. And then the other leg, well, this leg's really pushed back. So maybe here we keep that curve. This is the lower leg going this way. Here's the ankle. Here's the foot and toe. And then, you know, we can make a fun tail back there for the horse. So I hope that makes sense, right? I wanted to put something out there that I know gesture is something or a topic of interest, and this analytical method of gesture I know can feel like there's a bit more in terms of the right and the wrong of it, or it feels sometimes more severe from the standpoint of you have to do it a certain way. But I think the positive, or the other side of that, is there's great gains in the sense of it analyzes things so well that you can really take that language or that understanding and infinitely extend it, or at least that's my hope, right? Because then let's say you move past this and learn some other animals, and then let's say you move beyond that into what I can't do, which is invent creatures. Maybe you can start to wind and develop and mix different qualities of animal together into something that doesn't exist, while still keeping the kind of basic feeling of realism underneath. Anyways, let me know if you like this, if this is something that resonates with you, or would like to see more about the relationship between figures and animals.